Tevrick leaned back in his creaky old chair, the kind that threatened to give a spinal readjustment just by existing, and stared at the screen displaying the latest batch of government propaganda. Humans. The untamed species, it blared in bold, uninspired lettering. Underneath, a montage of grainy footage played, a series of images designed to remind everyone just why they were all crammed into this rusty, red hellhole of a quarantine zone on Mars. You know, I never get tired of their creativity, Tevrick mused, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I mean, look at that. They even found a clip of someone picking their nose. Truly terrifying. Clara, his second-in-command and chief pessimist, rolled her eyes. If they dug any deeper into the archives, they'd find footage of people sneezing and decide it's a biological attack. Tevrick chuckled, adjusting his chair to avoid yet another potential near-death experience. And to think they pay people to come up with this stuff. Gives me hope that one day we might actually get paid for existing. The room they occupied was a masterpiece of Martian architecture, if, by masterpiece, one meant a metal box that looked ready to collapse at the first sign of any real weather. It was a space meant for planning, but of course, under the oppressive regime, it was more like a haven for sarcasm and cynicism. You think they actually believe it? Asked Milo, the group's resident tech wizard and conspiracy theorist. He wore glasses that made him look slightly more intelligent than he was, though you'd never know it from his knack for hacking into government feeds. Believe what? That we're savage beasts who'll rip apart the galaxy if given half a chance. Tevrick snorted. It's a good bedtime story for the folks back home. Keeps them snug in their beds, dreaming of the day the universe is rid of us. Clara slid a cup of synthetic coffee towards him, the kind that tasted like it had been through a dozen regurgitations before landing in their cups. Drink up, Captain. We need all the delusions we can get our hands on. A loud clang echoed through the complex, followed by a series of smaller, worried clangs. Tevrick sighed. Sounds like Ortiz is at it again. Ortiz, their resident mechanical genius, or, more accurately, their mechanical disaster, was undoubtedly in the bowels of the structure, probably convincing a generator to live another day. No easy feat, considering the machinery here was as ancient as the propaganda itself. If Ortiz doesn't blow us up by accident, the Martian atmosphere will do it on purpose, Clara quipped, rubbing her temples. It's a wonder any of this stuff works. The wonders of hope and duct tape, Tevrick said. Mostly duct tape. The room's single window offered a stunning view of red nothingness, a barren landscape devoid of life and optimism. They were trapped here, like rats in a cage, only less well-fed and significantly more sarcastic. Tevrick turned his attention back to the screen just in time to catch the part where humans were depicted as the ultimate existential threat. His fingers danced over the control panel, muting the sound. Gods, if I have to hear that speech one more time, I'll start rooting for the aliens. Think they'd take us with them? Milo asked, hopefully. Only if they needed a good laugh, Clara responded, draining her cup and grimacing at the taste. Welcome to the Martian Comedy Club. The oppressive regime that held them in this metallic purgatory went by the charmingly unintimidating name of the Directorate. It was as if they'd chosen the most mundane name possible to lull people into a false sense of security. But under that bland exterior lay a system that controlled every aspect of life in the quarantine zone, from the air they breathed to the thoughts they dared to think. You ever wonder what life's like outside the bubble? Milo asked, a rare moment of sincerity sneaking into his voice. Tevrick shrugged. Probably worse than here. At least we know where we stand, right on the edge of oblivion. A voice crackled over the intercom. It was Ortiz, sounding both triumphant and slightly singed. Generators up and running again. Don't ask me how long it'll last, but for now, we've got power. Excellent, Tevrick replied. Now we can continue our mission of lounging around and pretending we're not completely screwed. Clara glanced at him, the corners of her mouth twitching upwards. What's the plan today, fearless leader? Tevrick leaned forward, his grin showing just how much he enjoyed the little things in life, like rebellion and caffeine. Same as every day. We find a way to stick it to the Directorate without getting ourselves killed. Bold, Milo said, pushing his glasses up his nose. And just crazy enough to get us killed. Ah, but where's the fun in playing it safe? Tevrick asked, the edge of madness in his voice as comforting as an old blanket. Besides, if it all goes sideways, we'll still have front row seats to the universe's greatest joke. Us. The group shared a laugh, The kind that only comes from people who've accepted their fate and decided to laugh in its face anyway. They might have been trapped on Mars, cut off from the rest of humanity, but that didn't mean they couldn't make the most of it. After all, they'd long ago embraced the wisdom of the universe. If you can't beat him, at least throw a pie in their face before they beat you. Tevrik, Clara said, suddenly serious, we got word from one of our contacts near the inner zone. Tevrik raised an eyebrow. And what did they have to say? Apparently, the directorate's planning something big. Something that'll change everything, for all of us. Another propaganda reel? Ortiz's voice chimed in over the speaker, now accompanied by the faint hum of a happy generator. Not quite, Clara replied. Something more permanent. Tevrik rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Well, isn't that intriguing? I do love a good mystery. We're already stuck in a mystery, boss, Milo quipped. It's called, what the hell are we still doing here? Fair point, Tevrik admitted. But if they're planning something permanent, then I suppose we should take a closer look. Can't have them pulling the rug out from under us without at least asking where the hell they got the fancy rug. The group settled into a silence punctuated by the rhythmic tapping of Ortiz's maintenance tools in the background. Here they were, in the middle of a Martian wasteland, facing threats from within and without, yet somehow, they'd found a way to keep going. Maybe it was madness, maybe it was defiance, or maybe it was just because they couldn't find the remote to change the channel. So, what's the plan, fearless leader? Clara asked, bringing them back to the grim reality of their situation. Tevrik's eyes sparkled with mischief and just a hint of desperation. We dig deeper, find out what the big surprise is. And when we do, we make sure to give the directorate a show they won't soon forget. Milo sighed, leaning back in his seat. Another day, another dance with death. Exactly, Tevrik nodded, feeling more alive than he had in years. And if we're lucky, maybe we'll get to lead. In the distance, the Martian wind howled its lonely tune, a reminder that even in the direst of times, the universe continued its relentless march. But for Tevrik and his crew, today wasn't about survival. It was about doing what they did best. Laughing in the face of doom, because after all, if they couldn't laugh, they might just end up crying. And that, they all agreed, was an indignity no self-respecting human should endure, especially not while stuck on Mars. The intercom crackled again, Ortiz's voice breaking the silence. Hey, Tevrik, I managed to pull some old files from the directorate's database. Looks like they really are planning something big. Fantastic, Tevrik said with a sigh. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse. What's the scoop? It's something called Project Exodus, Ortiz replied. And from the looks of it, it's got our fingerprints all over it. Clara groaned. Great, our very own eviction notice. Tevrik's mind raced. If this Project Exodus is as big as it sounds, then we need to stop it. But how? Milo asked, now completely engaged in spite of his earlier skepticism. The same way we always do, Tevrik said with a grin. By being the biggest thorn in their side they ever had the misfortune to encounter. You know, Clara said with a smile, for a guy with no plan, you've got an awful lot of confidence. Tevrik nodded. It's a gift, or a curse, depends on the day. They all knew the risks. They'd seen what happened to dissenters, how they disappeared without a trace, how their names became whispers instead of shouts. But that was just it. They refused to be whispers in the wind. On Mars, silence was just another word for defeat, and Tevrik and his crew were anything but defeated. All right, Milo said, pushing his glasses back up. Let's get to work then. Time to play chicken with fate. Tevrik clapped his hands. That's the spirit. Ortiz's voice crackled back over the intercom, a hint of excitement in his usually monotone delivery. And if we fail? Tevrik leaned back, basking in the glow of their defiance. Then at least we'll go down laughing. And with that, the group rose, ready to face whatever the universe threw at them. Because here in the quarantine zone, laughter was their weapon, and they intended to wield it with impunity. Tevrik sat back in his chair, arms folded behind his head, watching the propaganda screen do its usual best to brainwash them into compliance. A voice, smoother than snake oil and about as trustworthy, droned on about the dangers of human independence. You know, he began, addressing the room, if I were a brainwashed stooge, I'd probably find this comforting. Like a warm blanket of lies. Milo didn't bother looking up from his tinkering. It's a masterpiece of deceit, really. Makes me almost nostalgic for the days when they just told us we were doomed and called it a day. Tevric's attention shifted to the door as Leora, his best friend and self-appointed voice of reason, barged in looking like she'd just stumbled upon a gold mine. Or a particularly exciting conspiracy. Same difference in this place. Tevric, you won't believe the crap I just unearthed, she announced, waving a battered tablet like it was the Holy Grail. Try me, he said, intrigued. Can it beat the Directorate's bedtime stories? Depends. Leora grinned, the kind that promised either trouble or triumph. I've been trawling through their broadcasts, and guess what? They're not just spoon-feeding us propaganda. They're hiding messages. Milo perked up, pushing his glasses up his nose. Hidden messages? You mean like, the cake is a lie, kind of hidden, or are we talking actual useful stuff here? Useful, Leora confirmed, her eyes dancing with mischief. They've got a whole network of coded transmissions buried in their speeches. It's like they don't trust each other, so they're passing notes in class. Tevric leaned forward, his interest fully piqued. And you think we can use this? Oh, absolutely, Leora said, dropping into a chair. With a little tweaking, we could piggyback on their signals, spread a few alternative facts of our own. Clara, who'd been nursing what passed for a second cup of coffee, looked up with a sly smile. So, what are we talking here? Mind-altering memes? Uplifting anthems of rebellion? More like little nudges, Leora explained. Subtle stuff. Just enough to get people thinking for themselves. Maybe sow some chaos while we're at it. Tevric laughed, a sound that was half amusement, half genuine admiration. I like it. Nothing like a little chaos to spice up our otherwise monotonous doom. Milo cleared his throat, looking thoughtful. But how do we sell this to the good folks trapped in this lovely Martian prison? I don't know, Clara shrugged. Maybe start with, hi, we're not as screwed as you think. Catchy, Tevric said with a smirk. But let's aim for something a bit more sophisticated, shall we? Ortiz's voice crackled over the intercom yet again, apparently having installed himself as the unofficial eavesdropper of the group. If we're going for sophistication, maybe start with a joke? People love jokes. Perfect, Tevric nodded. We lead with a joke, then hit him with the truth. Or at least, our version of it. Think we can actually pull this off? Leora asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Might as well try, Tevric replied, his voice filled with a reckless sort of optimism. Worst case, we piss off the Directorate. Best case, we start something that'll make them wish they'd never laid eyes on Mars. Clara chuckled, leaning back in her seat. I can't decide which outcome I like better. Then let's get started, Milo said, enthusiasm creeping into his voice. If we're going to play the Directorate's game, we might as well cheat like hell. The group gathered around the table, the planning session quickly devolving into a whirlwind of ideas, half-baked schemes, and sarcastic commentary. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and definitely out of their minds, but none of that mattered. In this grim little corner of the universe, they were kings. Or at least, they were the jesters who'd convinced themselves they could be kings. As they dove into the intricacies of subverting government messages, the room filled with the sound of laughter and the occasional curse word, each one a tiny rebellion against the fate they'd been dealt. Tevric watched his crew, a motley collection of misfits and mad geniuses, and felt a strange stirring in his chest. Hope, maybe, or it could just be heartburn from the coffee. Either way, it was enough to keep him going for another day. Leora tapped a few keys on her tablet, projecting a complex web of signals and codes onto the screen. All right, folks, welcome to Propaganda 101. Today, we'll learn how to twist the truth into something vaguely resembling justice. Finally, Milo said with mock seriousness, something useful from all those years spent watching pirated broadcasts. Clara raised her empty cup in a mock toast. To the Directorate's downfall. May their lies trip them up before ours do. And here's to the glorious mess we're about to make, Tevric added, lifting his own mug. Long live the rebellion. They clinked their cups together, a solemn vow sealed with synthetic coffee and gallows humor. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And in this forgotten corner of the solar system, that was enough. Milo, ever the skeptic, raised a hand. Question. What happens if they catch on? We improvise, Tevric replied without missing a beat. I've always wanted to see if we could pull off a daring escape through Martian tunnels. Sounds like a plan, Leora said, her grin wide enough to light up the room. Or at least, enough of one to give the directorate nightmares. Nightmares we can definitely deliver, Clara agreed. We just need to make sure we don't become one ourselves. In that case, Tevrik said, let's get to work. The directorate won't know what hit them. With their usual mix of sarcasm and determination, they dove headfirst into the task at hand. It wasn't going to be easy, but then again, nothing worth doing ever was. And if they failed, well, at least they'd go down in style. As they worked, the hours slipped by, unnoticed in the haze of creativity and caffeine. Slowly but surely, their plan took shape, each piece falling into place like a morbidly hilarious jigsaw puzzle. But they weren't just rebuilding a message. They were constructing a weapon, one designed to pierce the heart of the directorate's lies and awaken the sleeping masses. And when that weapon was ready, they'd launch it with all the fanfare and irreverence they could muster. Tevrik took a step back, surveying their progress. Not bad for a bunch of no-good rebels stuck on Mars. Not bad at all, Leora agreed, her voice softening. It's almost like we're meant for this. Let's hope the universe agrees, Clara muttered, stretching her arms with a groan. Because if it doesn't, we're in for one hell of a wake-up call. Then let's make sure it never comes to that, Tevrik said, feeling the weight of their collective hopes and dreams pressing down on him. We can't afford to fail. Milo, ever the realist, spoke up. And if we do? Tevrik shrugged, flashing a grin that was equal parts defiance and madness. Then we give them the best damned show Mars has ever seen. They all laughed, their voices mingling with the hum of the generator and the distant howl of the Martian wind. For now, they were alive. For now, they had a chance. And that was more than enough. They returned to their work with renewed vigor, each of them driven by the unshakable belief that they could change their fate. Because even in the depth of despair and desolation, there was always a spark of hope. A flicker of light amidst the darkness. And if they could fan that spark into a flame, then maybe, just maybe, they could turn this rusty red hellhole into something worth living for. The room was a mess of wires, screens, and half-drunk mugs of what they optimistically called coffee. It smelled like burnt circuitry and desperation, a mix that Tevrik figured would make a great fragrance if they ever wanted to bottle the essence of failure. All right, Milo said, fiddling with a particularly stubborn bit of code. We're trying to alter propaganda without making it obvious. Like sneaking a bad joke into a funeral speech. Clara snorted, her eyes bloodshot from staring at too many screens. Maybe we should start with something simple. Like, your government's full of crap. Vote for Martian independence. Tevrik shook his head. Too subtle, Clara. They'll never get it. Okay, Leora interjected, trying to mediate as usual. Let's keep it low-key. Maybe insert a few lines that don't quite fit. Enough to make people pause. Right, Milo said, typing furiously. Nothing screams rebellion like questionable grammar. As they worked, the tension in the room thickened. It was like trying to defuse a bomb, except the bomb was an entire population of brainwashed Martians, and the fuse was the directorate's iron grip on their minds. Anyone else get the feeling we're playing with fire here? Clara asked, rubbing her temples. I mean, what if we screw it up and they notice? Tevrik shrugged. Then we're the idiots who accidentally became martyrs. At least we won't have to worry about rent anymore. Despite the bravado, Tevrik felt the weight of the risk. They were poking the bear, and not just any bear. A bear with a nasty habit of vaporizing anyone who dared to question its authority. Milo groaned as his screen flickered. Bloody thing keeps crashing. I swear, this old tech is held together with spit and prayers. Yeah, well, Leora said. We're short on prayers, so start spitting. A moment of tense silence followed, broken only by the sound of Milo's keyboard clacking like a death rattle. His glasses slid down his nose again, and he pushed them back up with a sigh. These messages aren't just encrypted, they're like a damn labyrinth. Guess the directorate doesn't trust their own propaganda, Tevrik said. Can't imagine why. That's the thing, Leora added. They've got layers of security here, like they're hiding something even they don't want to know. Or maybe they're just paranoid, Clara suggested. I mean, if I were constantly lying to billions of people, I'd be paranoid too. Tevrik couldn't help but laugh. Who knew keeping people in the dark was so much work? As they continued to piece together their improvised digital Trojan horse, the atmosphere shifted. It was one thing to joke about overthrowing a corrupt regime, but another entirely to actually attempt it. I just don't get why we're doing this, Milo said, breaking the uneasy silence. I mean, what if this goes south? We could end up making things worse. Leora shot him a look. And what if we don't? What if we just sit here and do nothing while they turn us into obedient little drones? Is that better? Milo hesitated, then sighed. I don't know. I just don't want to end up as one of those, well, they tried, stories. Hey, at least we'll have each other in the afterlife, Tevrik said, not entirely joking. The group fell into a half-hearted debate about the ethics of their mission. Was it right to manipulate people's perceptions, even if it was for a good cause? Did the ends justify the means, or were they just as bad as the directorate? Look, Clara said finally, we can argue about this all day, but the fact is, no one's coming to save us. It's up to us to do something. True, Tevrik agreed, and if we're going down, let's at least go down swinging. Their determination renewed, they returned to their task. Wires were crossed, code was written, and Milo's glasses kept slipping down his nose in a constant, frustrating dance. The hours dragged on, and as the sun set over the rusty Martian landscape, the room was filled with the low hum of machinery and the occasional expletive. Finally, Leora leaned back, stretching her arms with relief. All right, I think we've got something. Tevrik raised an eyebrow. A miracle? More like a miracle with a death wish, Milo muttered, rubbing his eyes. But yeah, we might just have a working prototype. Let's see it, Clara said, leaning forward. Leora tapped a few keys on her tablet, and the propaganda screen flickered, displaying a message that was so absurd, so obviously out of place, that Tevrik couldn't help but laugh. Vote for Lizard Overlords 2025. Really? Leora grinned. Hey, if we're going to get caught, might as well make them question their sanity first. Milo adjusted his glasses, peering at the screen with a mix of skepticism and pride. Well, it's not going to win us any awards, but it'll do. Tevrik nodded, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and dread. All right, let's get this show on the road. As they prepared to broadcast their first altered message, the reality of their situation hit Tevrik like a freight train. They were about to commit what might be the single most reckless act in the history of the Martian quarantine zone. And he couldn't wait. Okay, here goes nothing, Leora said, her finger hovering over the button like a guillotine blade. Sure you don't want to say a few last words? Clara quipped. Tevrik grinned. How about, we regret nothing. With a nod from Tevrik, Leora pressed the button, and their message went live. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered, and the familiar drone of the government's lies echoed through the room. Only now, interspersed with absurdities and contradictions that would hopefully plant the seeds of doubt in those who watched. Well, Milo said, his voice tinged with disbelief, now we wait. The waiting was the hardest part. In the hours that followed, the air was thick with tension, and every sound seemed amplified by 1,000. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, Tevrik broke the silence. So, what's our next move if they notice? Die in a blaze of glory? Clara suggested, only half joking. Or, Leora countered, we could try not getting caught. Milo shook his head. Easier said than done when we've just pissed off the most powerful organization in the solar system. Hey, we're nothing if not ambitious, Tevrik said, trying to lighten the mood. Hours passed, and with them, the initial adrenaline rush faded, leaving only uncertainty and more questions. Do you think people will notice the changes? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They'd have to be blind not to, Milo said. It's like trying to hide a cow in a chicken coop. Yeah, but will they care? Leora pointed out. I mean, we're talking about a population that's been spoon-fed the same lies for years. They might just ignore it. Tevrik frowned, considering the possibility. And if they do, then we try again, Leora said firmly. We keep pushing until they can't ignore us anymore. Their conversation drifted into silence again, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Despite everything, there was an undercurrent of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could make a difference. Hey, Tevrik said suddenly, breaking the quiet. You ever think we're just a bunch of idiots tilting at windmills? Clara chuckled. Constantly. But what else are we going to do? Knit? Tevrik laughed, feeling a little of the tension seep away. Guess you're right. The hours dragged on, and the weight of what they'd done settled over them like a shroud. It was a gamble, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But as they sat in their ramshackle command center, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the distant howl of the Martian wind. They felt something else, a sense of purpose. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone trapped in this rusty red hellhole, for everyone who'd ever dared to dream of something better. And for now, that was enough. The day after their DIY broadcast, the air in the quarantine zone was thick with a new kind of tension, like someone had swapped out the oxygen for existential dread. Tevrik watched the dusty Martian sky turn a deeper shade of rust, the universal sign that if today's miseries hadn't killed you, tomorrow's were just waiting their turn. He turned to see Clara squinting at their propaganda screen, her bloodshot eyes a testament to too many late nights and too much caffeine. "So, does anyone think we're heroes yet?" she asked, her voice dry as a sandstorm. "Depends. Are we talking about the kind that save the day or the kind that get themselves vaporized?" Milo replied, pushing his eternally slipping glasses back up his nose. "Well, if they start building statues of us, I hope they capture my good side," Tevrik said, smirking. Leora shook her head, her fingers dancing across her tablet. "Focus, people. The directorate's not exactly known for their sense of humor. We've got to stay under their radar." "Yeah, well, their radar's about to get a hell of a workout." "Check this out," Milo said. He gestured at the garbled code on his screen, which looked more like a toddler's attempt at modern art than a coherent program. "They've tightened security. It's like they're expecting us." "No surprise there," Clara remarked. "We did just poke the bear. Or whatever the Martian equivalent of a bear is. A rock, maybe?" Tevrik leaned over Milo's shoulder, peering at the mess of wires and blinking lights. "Can we hack it?" Milo let out a sigh that seemed to contain all the frustrations of the known universe. "Maybe, if we can convince this ancient tech to cooperate. It's a miracle it hasn't exploded yet." "Great. Our lives depend on something held together with duct tape and sheer willpower." "Nothing could possibly go wrong," Tevrik quipped. Leora looked up from her tablet, her expression grim. "We're running out of time. The directorate's rolling out increased surveillance, more drones, more checkpoints. It's like they're preparing for a war. Or a very aggressive game of hide and seek," Tevrik muttered. Clara rubbed her temples, probably wishing for a life that involved more sleep and fewer death-defying schemes. "So, what's the plan? Do we back down and hope they forget about us, or do we double down and risk everything?" Milo adjusted his glasses, a determined glint in his eyes. "We double down. We've come this far. No point in half-assing a revolution, right?" "Yeah," Tevrik said, a forced bravado in his voice. "Besides, who wants to live forever? People who aren't idiots," Leora cut in, her sarcasm sharp enough to draw blood. "But fine. Let's escalate. Just try not to get us killed. I'd hate to spend eternity with you lot." The room filled with a tense silence, broken only by the whir of ancient machinery and the distant hum of drones patrolling the quarantine zone. It was a sound that had become as familiar as their own heartbeats, a constant reminder of the directorate's watchful gaze. "If we're going to do this," Leora continued, "we need to make it count. We need to find a way to disrupt their entire network, not just a screen or two." "That's a tall order," Milo said, rubbing his bleary eyes. "But we've come this far. Besides, nothing says, 'good morning,' like a bit of light treason." Clara gave a wry smile. "Let's hope we live long enough to regret this." With renewed determination, they returned to their work. The room was a mess of tangled cables and scattered papers, the result of too many frantic attempts to patch together a plan from the scraps of old technology. Hours passed, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Martian landscape in shades of crimson and shadow, the tension in the room thickened. They were playing a high-stakes game, and the odds were far from in their favor. Tevrik sat back, taking a moment to study his fellow conspirators. Despite the exhaustion etched into their faces, there was a spark of something more, defiance, maybe, or the stubborn refusal to bow down to a regime that saw them as little more than pests to be controlled. "So, any bright ideas?" Clara asked, breaking the silence. "Or are we just winging it as usual?" Milo let out a short laugh. "Winging it? Us? Never." Leora looked thoughtful, her fingers tapping against the edge of her tablet. "We need a distraction, something big enough to draw their attention away from us, at least for a while." Tevrik nodded slowly, "Like a Martian carnival with free food and no surveillance." "Exactly," Leora said, her eyes narrowing with focus. If we can hack into one of their mainframes, maybe we can trigger a false alarm. Get them scrambling while we slip in and do our thing. Sounds risky, Milo said, his voice tinged with doubt. But I guess that's the theme of the week. Risky? Please, Clara said, crossing her arms. We eat risky for breakfast. We're practically connoisseurs at this point. Yeah, well, let's hope we don't choke on it, Milo said, turning back to his screen. Okay, let's get to work. We need to be fast and quiet. As they set about implementing their hastily concocted plan, Tevrik couldn't shake the sense of impending doom that clung to the air like a bad smell. It was the kind of feeling that meant you were either on the verge of victory or about to get your backside handed to you. The minutes ticked by, each one bringing them closer to the moment of truth. The room was filled with the sound of frantic typing, punctuated by the occasional curse as something inevitably went wrong. Finally, Leora looked up, her expression triumphant. I've got it. The mainframe's been compromised. We've got a window, about 10 minutes tops. Tevrik felt a surge of adrenaline, mixed with a healthy dose of fear. 10 minutes. No pressure or anything. The group sprang into action, each of them taking on their roles with a practiced efficiency that belied the chaos around them. They were a well-oiled machine, albeit one held together with stubbornness and caffeine. As the seconds ticked away, Tevrik felt the weight of their task settle over him like a physical thing. They were about to pull off something that might just tip the scales in their favor, or blow up in their faces spectacularly. Here goes nothing, Clara said, her voice steady despite the tension. Milo nodded, his eyes locked on the screen. All right, let's make history, or at least a decent footnote. The room was silent, save for the steady hum of machinery, and the occasional beep from the various devices they'd cobbled together. It was the sound of desperation, of hope, of 1,000 unanswered questions. Tevrik watched as their plan unfolded, the minutes slipping away like sand through his fingers. It was a gamble, the biggest they'd ever taken, and the stakes couldn't be higher. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The screens flickered, displaying the familiar government propaganda. Tevrik held his breath, waiting for the telltale signs of success or failure. Milo let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Looks like we did it. Their system's in chaos. For now, Leora said, her voice tempered with caution. But they'll figure it out eventually. We need to be ready to move. Right, Tevrik said, a grin spreading across his face despite the danger that still loomed over them. Let's make sure they remember this day as the one they underestimated a bunch of scrappy Martians. Clara chuckled. And if not, we'll just make sure our last words were clever. The group shared a brief moment of camaraderie, a sense of unity born from shared struggle and the knowledge that they were in this fight together, for better or worse. As the dust settled and the adrenaline faded, Tevrik realized that this was just the beginning. They'd made their move, and now it was up to the universe to decide their fate. In the days that followed, the Directorate's response was swift and brutal. Surveillance increased tenfold. Checkpoints sprang up like weeds, and the propaganda machine roared to life with renewed vigor. But for all their bluster and intimidation, the regime couldn't erase the seeds of doubt that Tevrik's group had sown. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As they huddled together in their cramped headquarters, surrounded by the tools of their rebellion, Tevrik felt a flicker of hope. It was a fragile thing, easily snuffed out, but it was there. And as long as it existed, they had something worth fighting for. For now, they would keep pushing, keep fighting, keep dreaming of a future where they weren't just Martians in a cage, but free individuals defining their own destinies. And with that thought, Tevrik returned to his work, ready to face whatever came next. The cramped headquarters of Tevrik's ragtag crew was quieter than usual. The silence was a stark contrast to the chaos they usually thrived in. Well, thrived might be a strong word. Survived? Endured? Tripped over their own feet and managed not to fall flat on their faces. Yeah, that seemed more accurate. Milo was hunched over his mess of wires and screens, looking like a mad scientist trying to resurrect a long-forgotten toaster. Clara was at the propaganda screen, squinting at the latest Directorate drivel like it was a particularly annoying zit that just wouldn't pop. Leora was buried in her tablet, fingers tapping away like the fate of the universe rested on her getting just one more high score. Tevrik, on the other hand, was leaning back in his chair, taking in the Martian sky through a crack in the ceiling. It looked like a rusty hellhole, but it was their rusty hellhole, damn it, Hey, Tevrik, Leora called, not glancing up from her screen. Quit daydreaming. We've got to figure out our next move before the drones start knocking on our door with gift baskets full of handcuffs. Yeah, Tevrik replied, waving a hand dismissively. Just contemplating the futility of our existence and all that. Deep thoughts for a guy who can't remember where he put his boots this morning, Clara chimed in, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Tevrik smirked. What can I say? I'm a man of contradictions. Milo, glasses slipping down his nose as usual, let out a sigh heavy enough to collapse a star. Focus, people. We're playing with fire here, and I'm fresh out of marshmallows. Right, because our biggest problem is a lack of snacks, Tevrik said, rolling his eyes. So, any bright ideas, or are we just going to keep poking the bear until it bites our heads off? Leora set her tablet down, looking around the room like a teacher about to give a particularly dumb student a stern talking to. We need to stay low for now. Lay low, keep quiet, and watch for any signs that the directorate's catching on. Clara snorted. Lay low? That's not exactly our style, is it? We make noise like a bull in a china shop. A very loud, very clumsy bull. Tevrik opened his mouth to reply, but the sound of a distant explosion cut him off. The ground trembled and dust rained down from the ceiling, coating everything in a fine, irritating layer. Well, that's not ominous, Milo muttered, adjusting his glasses as if that might somehow make the situation less dire. A moment later, the door burst open, and a figure stumbled in. It was Euron, one of their supposed allies. He looked like he'd just sprinted through a sandstorm, which, on Mars, was more than just a figure of speech. Tevrik, we have a problem, Euron panted, leaning heavily against the doorframe. He looked like a man on the brink, eyes wild and desperate. Yeah, I noticed, Tevrik replied dryly. What did you do? Set off fireworks in Directorate HQ? Euron shook his head, panic etching lines into his face. They know. About us. About everything. Someone sold us out. The room went still, the weight of Euron's words settling over them like a leaden shroud. Betrayed. The word echoed in Tevrik's mind, a bitter taste that wouldn't go away. Who? Leora asked, voice sharp, eyes colder than the void. Who betrayed us? Euron hesitated, his gaze flicking to Tevrik, before settling on the floor. I don't know, but they've got info on our hideout, our plans, everything. There's a squad on its way. Great, Tevrik said, standing up. Just what we needed, a housewarming party with uninvited guests. How long do we have? Not long, maybe 10 minutes tops, Euron replied, shifting from foot to foot like a kid who got caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Pack it up, folks, Leora said, her voice all business. We can't stay here. The group sprang into action, grabbing essentials and shoving them into bags. There was no time for sentimentality, no room for hesitation. Every second counted. Leave the coffee mugs, Tevrik said, eyeing the mess of stained ceramic with disdain. They're not worth dying for. Speak for yourself, Clara replied, tucking one under her arm like it was a prized possession. As they moved, Tevrik felt a pang of loss. This place, as much of a dump as it was, had been their home. Now they were leaving it behind, running like rats from a sinking ship. Where do we go? Milo asked, his voice strained with the weight of all the unanswered questions. Somewhere with fewer explosions, Tevrik replied, slinging a bag over his shoulder. Let's just get out of here before the Directorate throws us a going-away party with laser beams. They slipped out of the building, moving through the shadows like ghosts. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the distant roar of engines getting closer by the minute. How did this happen? Milo asked, voice barely above a whisper as they ducked down an alleyway. I thought we were careful. Careful doesn't mean invincible, Leora replied, scanning the area for any signs of pursuit. We got too bold, too loud. And now we're paying for it. Tevrik felt anger simmering beneath his skin, a white-hot rage that threatened to boil over. But he tamped it down, focusing on the task at hand. There'd be time for righteous fury later. Right now, they needed to survive. As they made their way through the quarantine zone, Tevrik couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide an enemy, every sound was a potential threat. Watch your step, Tevrik muttered as they crossed a street littered with debris. Last thing we need is a twisted ankle slowing us down. They reached the edge of the quarantine zone, the border marked by a flickering electric fence that buzzed like an angry wasp. Tevrik paused, looking out at the vast expanse of barren Martian landscape beyond. "Guess we're officially outlaws now," Clara said, joining him at the fence. "All we need are some cowboy hats and a catchy theme song." "Yeah, well, I'd settle for a plan that doesn't involve us getting arrested or shot," Tevrik replied, his mind racing with possibilities. Leora came up beside them, her expression as grim as ever. "We need to find somewhere safe to regroup. Figure out who sold us out and why." Tevrik nodded, determination hardening his features. "And when we do, we'll make them regret it. Nobody betrays us and gets away with it." "That's the spirit," Milo said, though his attempt at cheeriness fell flat in the face of their predicament. They slipped through a gap in the fence, leaving the quarantine zone behind. As they trudged across the crimson landscape, Tevrik couldn't help but wonder if they'd ever find their way back. The headquarters might have been a dump, but it had been their dump. Now they were just three Martians on the run, caught in a web of deception and danger that seemed all too ready to tighten around their necks. Night fell, casting long shadows that danced across the barren ground. They moved in silence, the weight of betrayal hanging over them like a suffocating fog. "Got any jokes to lighten the mood, Tevrik?" Clara asked, her voice a thin attempt at levity. "What's red, dusty, and just got royally screwed?" Tevrik replied. "Mars?" Clara guessed. "Yes," Tevrik said with a mirthless chuckle. They kept moving, every step taking them further from a past they couldn't quite leave behind and towards an uncertain future that loomed like a storm on the horizon. The night stretched on, and with it, the questions that gnawed at Tevrik's mind. Who had betrayed them? Why? And what would they do when they finally found the answers? For now, though, all they could do was keep moving. Keep fighting. Keep hoping that somewhere down the line, they'd find a way to turn the tables and reclaim what they'd lost. Because if there was one thing Tevrik knew, it was that Martians didn't go down without a fight. And this was one fight he was determined to win, no matter the cost. The crew trudged through the Martian wasteland, each step kicking up a cloud of fine red dust that clung to them like an overly affectionate ex. Tevrik led the way, his mind swirling with a mix of anger, frustration, and the vague hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd live to see another day. Or, at the very least, die in a way that was marginally amusing. Clara trudged along beside him, her boots making squelching noises in the dust. "So, any bright ideas, fearless leader, or are we just gonna wander around until we drop dead from boredom?" Tevrik shot her a sideways glance. "I'm working on it. Inspiration doesn't just drop out of the sky, you know. Unless we're talking about meteors," Milo piped up from the back, fiddling with a piece of wiring he'd insisted on bringing. "Those drop out of the sky all the time." "Thank you, Captain Obvious," Clara replied dryly. "Good to know we've got a walking encyclopedia of useless facts with us." "Hey, useless facts are my specialty," Milo grinned. "Keeps things interesting." "Interesting, right," Leora interjected, still tapping away on her tablet like her life depended on it. "Just what we need when we're being hunted by a regime that considers us public enemy number one." They fell into a sullen silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The Martian night stretched out before them, as cold and unwelcoming as a mother-in-law after an awkward family dinner. The only sound was the crunch of their boots against the rocky surface and the occasional cough from the ever-present dust. Tevrik's mind churned, trying desperately to piece together a plan out of the tattered remnants of their situation. Betrayed, hunted, a hair's breadth away from a one-way trip to Directorate Prison, or worse. It was a regular day in paradise. And then, like a spark in the darkness, an idea flickered to life. It wasn't fully formed, but it was there, and it was just crazy enough to work. Or blow up in their faces. But hey, at this point, what did they have to lose? "Hey," Tevrik said, stopping in his tracks. The others halted, looking at him expectantly. "What if we turn the Directorate's own tactics against them?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "Care to elaborate, or should we start guessing? You know how the Directorate uses propaganda to control the masses, keep everyone scared and compliant?" Tevrik continued, his voice rising with excitement. "What if we did the same thing? Use their own tools to incite fear and chaos among their ranks?" Milo nodded slowly, the flicker of understanding dancing in his eyes. "Create a counter-propaganda network. Broadcast messages that undermine their authority, make them look incompetent. Exactly, Tevrik said, his mind racing now. We plant seeds of doubt, confusion. If we can make them paranoid enough, they'll be too busy fighting each other to worry about us. Leora paused her relentless tapping, looking up with a glimmer of interest. It's risky, but it just might work. And we have access to some of their broadcasting tech, don't we? Stolen from the last raid, Clara confirmed. Old tech, but it might do the trick. If Milo can work his magic. Milo pushed his glasses up his nose, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Oh, I'll make it sing. The plan started to take shape, each of them contributing ideas, refining the details. It was audacious, reckless, and likely to get them killed if it went wrong. But it was also their best shot at turning the tables. So, where do we set up? Clara asked, scanning the horizon for any hint of shelter. Tevrik considered their options, which were about as plentiful as a vegan menu at a steakhouse. There's an old comms tower not too far from here. Abandoned, thanks to the Directorate's efficiency. We can rig it up to broadcast our message. Convenient, Leora noted wryly. Almost like someone planned for us to find it. Yeah, well, if it turns out to be a trap, at least we'll die doing something interesting, Tevrik replied with a shrug. Let's get moving. They pressed on, the faint outline of the comms tower eventually coming into view against the Martian night. It loomed like a skeletal reminder of human ambition, a relic of a past that had been left to rust in the harsh red dust. Home sweet home, Clara muttered as they approached the tower, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Let's hope the neighborhood's friendly, Tevrik replied, leading the way inside. The inside of the tower was as decrepit as they'd feared, but it was shelter, and it had the basic components they needed. Milo immediately set to work on the equipment, his fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon and the enthusiasm of someone who'd just been given the keys to a nuclear reactor. How long do you need? Leora asked, her eyes scanning the entrance for any signs of unwelcome visitors. Few hours, maybe less, Milo replied, already lost in his work. Depends on how much duct tape we have. Tevrik nodded, turning his attention to Clara and Leora. While Milo works his magic, we need to come up with the right message. Something that'll hit the Directorate where it hurts. Fear's a good motivator, Clara suggested. Make them doubt each other. Make them see threats where there aren't any. Paranoia, Leora added. Plant the idea that their own people are turning against them. Tevrik nodded, feeling the pieces fall into place. We spread rumors of dissent, sabotage. Make them question their own security. Sounds like a plan, Clara said, cracking a rare smile. Let's see how they like a taste of their own medicine. As they worked, a sense of purpose returned to the group, banishing the earlier despair. It wasn't much, just a sliver of hope in a world that seemed hell-bent on crushing them. But it was enough to keep them going, enough to remind them that they still had a fighting chance. Tevrik watched his crew, feeling a swell of pride despite the circumstances. They were battered, bruised, and on the run, but they were his team. And together, they just might pull off the impossible. Hey, Tevrik, Milo called from the tangled mess of wires and screens. You ever think maybe we should have just stuck to a nice, safe job? Like farming, or accounting. Too boring, Tevrik replied, grinning. Besides, where's the fun in that? Milo chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. Right, fun. That's what this is. Well, if we pull this off, Clara said, leaning against a console, I'll consider it a damn miracle. Miracles aren't our style, Tevrik replied. We make our own luck. Now let's make the Directorate sweat. Hours passed in a blur of activity, the crew working seamlessly together despite the odds. Milo's mutterings of, "Come on, you piece of junk," filled the air, punctuated by the occasional spark as he coaxed the ancient technology back to life. Finally, with a triumphant shout, Milo stepped back from the console, glasses askew but eyes shining with victory. We're online. Let's do this, Tevrik said, stepping up to the microphone. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling over him. People of Mars, he began, his voice steady and strong. You've been lied to, betrayed by those who claim to protect you. The Directorate's grip is weakening. Their own fear will be their undoing. Rise, question, resist. The words flowed, each one a carefully crafted challenge to the status quo, a call to arms for those who'd been cowed into submission for far too long. As the message continued to broadcast, Tevrik felt a surge of defiance, a fierce determination to see this through to the end. They were few, outnumbered, and outgunned, but they had something the Directorate lacked. A cause worth fighting for. When the broadcast ended, a tense silence filled the room, the weight of their actions hanging heavy in the air. They'd thrown a stone into the pond, and now all they could do was wait for the ripples to spread. Well, Clara said, breaking the silence. Here's hoping they take the bait. One way or another, things are about to get interesting, Leora added, her eyes glinting with a mixture of nerves and excitement. Tevrik nodded, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease just a fraction. They'd taken a gamble, and now they had to see it through to the end, come what may. But for the first time in a long while, they had a plan. A glimmer of hope in a world that had offered them precious little. And if Tevrik had learned anything from his time on Mars, it was this. Hope was a powerful thing. They settled into wait, each of them acutely aware of the ticking clock, the ever-present threat that loomed just beyond the horizon. But they were ready, and for the first time, it felt like they were the ones holding the cards. As they kept watch, Tevrik couldn't help but feel a spark of anticipation, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide in their favor. Because if there was one thing he knew for certain, it was that Martians didn't roll over. They fought, they resisted, and they never gave up. And this was one battle they intended to win, one way or another. The comms tower hummed like an arthritic old man trying to get out of bed in the morning, creaky, unreliable, and likely to collapse under the slightest pressure. Still, it was our last hope to flip the script on our Directorate overlords, and we were going to ride that rusty mule until it gave up the ghost. All right, Milo, Tevrik said, watching the hacker furiously tap away at his console, tell me something good. Milo didn't look up, too busy coaxing life out of wires that probably hadn't seen electricity since the last century. Well, if by good you mean I haven't electrocuted myself yet, then great. But if you're talking about the tech, it's like trying to milk a rock. Thanks for the visual, Clara chimed in, leaning against a wall that looked about as stable as a politician's promise. Never thought I'd miss the comfort of a rickety spaceship. Cheer up, Leora said, tapping away on her tablet with the speed of a caffeinated squirrel. At least here we have a roof over our heads. More or less, Tevrik chuckled, though it was more out of desperation than humor. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back now. They were about to take on the Directorate with nothing but a busted tower, some questionable tech, and a whole lot of attitude. Classic underdog story, only real life was messier and had a hell of a lot more dust. Okay, folks, Tevrik said, trying to sound confident. Time for the final touch. Leora, you ready? Leora nodded, her fingers flying across her screen. Damn right, this message is gonna make their heads spin. A few whispers of revolt, sprinkle in a dash of paranoia. It's the recipe for disaster. Their disaster. Milo gave a thumbs up without looking away from his work. Tower's hot. Get ready to broadcast some righteous chaos. Tevrik took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down like a lead blanket. All right, let's do this. Fire it up, Milo. The ancient tech sputtered to life, groaning like an old dog that didn't want to fetch one more stick. The screens flickered, displaying the familiar Directorate propaganda, minds under control, everyone happy, the future bright. Except it was all a load of horse manure, and they all knew it. People of Mars, Tevrik began, his voice booming through the tower, you've been fed lies. The Directorate claims to protect you, but they're the ones holding the chains. Break free, stand with us, demand the truth. As he spoke, Leora worked her magic, embedding hidden messages in the broadcast, a recipe to cook up dissent in every corner of the zone. It was risky, but if there was one thing Tevrik had learned from this whole mess, it was that you couldn't change anything by playing it safe. Clara was watching the screens, her eyes scanning for any signs of interruption. Looks like it's going through, she said, her voice low and intense. No sign of interference yet. That's because they're not expecting it, Leora replied, her eyes gleaming with mischief. They think they're untouchable. Well, let's give them a surprise party they won't forget, Milo muttered, adjusting his glasses. Time for the worms to turn. The broadcast continued, the message spreading like wildfire across the Martian settlement. For the first time in a long time, hope was in the air, a risky, fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. If they could get enough people to question, to doubt, maybe they'd stand a chance. How long until they catch on, you think? Clara asked, always the pragmatist. Not long, Tevrik admitted, keeping one eye on the door, half expecting troops to burst in any second. But long enough to stir the pot. By the time they realize what's happening, we'll have set the stage for a nice, big rebellion. Leora grinned, her fingers a blur on the tablet. This is gonna piss them off. Love it, yeah. Well, let's hope they don't take it out on us, Milo said, trying to sound nonchalant but failing spectacularly. As they worked, the atmosphere in the tower grew tense, charged with the energy of defiance. It was as if the whole planet was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The Directorate had been the unchallenged power for too long, and it was time to remind them that Martians weren't just faces in a crowd. They were individuals with voices, opinions, and the will to fight. The hours ticked by, and Tevrik kept glancing at the screens, waiting for the inevitable backlash. It was only a matter of time before the Directorate would respond, and when they did, it wouldn't be with kind words and understanding. Finally, Milo leaned back, stretching his arms above his head with a groan. There, that should keep the signal bouncing around for a while. Enough to make them chase their tails, at least. Tevrik nodded, a rare smile cracking his lips. Good work, everyone. Now we wait. Waiting wasn't exactly their strong suit, but they had little choice. The message was out there, and all they could do was hope that it would catch fire. If it didn't, they'd be looking at a very short life expectancy. Anyone else feel like we're standing on the edge of a cliff? Clara asked, peering out at the Martian landscape, the red dust swirling like a bad omen. More like already fallen and just waiting to hit the ground, Milo replied with a grim laugh. Hey, if we're going down, let's make sure we leave a mark, Leora said, ever the optimist. The room fell silent again, each of them lost in their thoughts, the weight of their actions hanging heavy in the air. Tevrik could almost hear the clock ticking down, each second bringing them closer to whatever fate awaited them. And then, like a miracle, or perhaps a well-timed disaster, a noise broke the silence. A distant rumble, growing louder, echoing through the thin Martian air. What the hell is that? Tevrik asked, his instincts kicking into overdrive. Milo scrambled to the screens, his fingers dancing over the keys. Looks like a crowd, maybe? Heading this way. A crowd? Clara repeated, her brow furrowed. That doesn't sound good. Or maybe it does, Leora countered, a spark of hope in her eyes. Maybe the message worked. Tevrik felt his heart skip a beat. Could it be? Had they really managed to light a fire under the Directorate's regime? Only one way to find out. Let's go meet our guests, he said, grabbing his gear and heading for the door. But keep your weapons handy. Just in case. They stepped out into the Martian night, the cold biting at their skin, the red dust swirling around them like a living thing. The noise grew louder, and soon they saw them, people, dozens of them, marching toward the tower with determined expressions. Some carried makeshift weapons, others just the fire of rebellion in their eyes. Looks like we kicked over the anthill, Milo said, staring at the approaching crowd with a mix of awe and trepidation. Tevrik nodded, feeling a surge of pride. They'd done it, they'd made a difference. But the battle was just beginning, and it was going to take everything they had to see it through. All right, he said, addressing the crowd as they gathered around the tower. You've heard the call. Now it's time to make our stand. The Directorate's held us down for too long. It's time to fight back. Cheers erupted from the crowd, a roar of defiance that echoed across the Martian wasteland. It was a sound Tevrik had never expected to hear, but it filled him with a fierce determination. Spread the word, Clara added, her voice strong and clear. We need everyone, all of Mars, to rise up. Together, we can take them down. Milo raised a fist, grinning like a madman. Let's give him hell, folks. As the crowd dispersed, the plan was set in motion. Messages were sent, calls to arms ringing out across the settlement. The Directorate wouldn't know what hit them. Tevrik turned to his crew, the weight of what they'd started settling over him like a lead blanket. This is it. We've opened the floodgates. Now we need to keep the pressure on. Bring it on, Leora said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. I've always wanted to stick it to the man. Just remember, Clara cautioned, this isn't gonna be easy. They're not gonna roll over and play dead. Tevrik nodded, knowing full well what they were up against. But for the first time, it felt like they were the ones holding the cards. The Directorate might have the numbers, the guns, and the tech, but they had something more powerful. The will to fight, the drive to stand up against tyranny. And if there was one thing Tevrik had learned, it was that a determined group of Martians could be more dangerous than any weapon. As they prepared for the next phase of their plan, Tevrik felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. They were going to win this fight, one way or another, and they were going to do it on their terms. Leora, he said, keep the broadcasts going. We need to keep the pressure on. On it, she replied, already tapping away on her tablet. Clara, Milo, you're with me. Let's rally the troops. We need to keep this momentum going. With a final nod, Tevrik led the way, ready to face whatever came next. They'd started something bigger than themselves, and now it was time to see it through to the end. As they moved out into the Martian night, one thing was clear. The Directorate's days were numbered. And they were the ones holding the clock. The rebellion had begun, and there was no turning back. The Martian night was as cold and unforgiving as an X's glare, but the air thrummed with something new. Hope, or maybe just the shared delusion that this wasn't all for nothing. Tevrik stood at the center of a ragtag assembly of rebels, each one of them as rough around the edges as an asteroid in a bar fight. The Directorate had no idea what was about to hit them. A wave of pissed-off Martians armed with hasty plans and the kind of optimism usually reserved for lottery winners and first-time parents. All right, folks, Tevrik started, his voice as steady as a ship in a storm. We've set the ball rolling. Anyone got a plan for when it smashes into the Directorate's face? Milo adjusted his glasses, which were about as useful as a chocolate teapot when it came to making him look smart, but damn if they didn't make him feel it. If we're lucky, they'll turn on each other like a pack of rabid dogs over a bone. If we're not, Clara chimed in, her eyes scanning the room as if she was planning who she'd shoot first when it all went to hell. Then we improvise, Leora answered, a smirk playing on her lips. And by improvise, I mean we run like hell and hope they can't aim. The crowd of rebels murmured in agreement. The plan was far from perfect, but then again, they'd gotten this far on little more than spit and defiance. Why start planning now? Tevrik nodded, his mind racing faster than a smuggler with stolen goods. All right, let's make sure everyone knows their roles. We need to keep the Directorate guessing, keep them off balance. Just another day in paradise, Milo quipped, his fingers twitching from caffeine or nerves, probably both. The group broke up, each member going to their assigned tasks, leaving Tevrik with his core crew. He watched them go, felt the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders like an anvil tied to a helium balloon. You ever think we'd get this far? I'd have settled for not getting shot, Clara replied with a half-hearted grin. That's the spirit, Leora said, patting her on the back. See? Optimism. They all shared a laugh, the kind that comes not from genuine humor but from the absurdity of the situation. Here they were, a handful of disillusioned misfits taking on a regime that considered them as significant as space dust on a boot. Time to get this party started, Tevrik said, more to himself than anyone else. The words felt hollow, but better hollow than silent. Leora, keep an eye on the broadcasts. We can't let them regain control. She nodded, already lost in her tablet, fingers dancing like a pianist on a time constraint. Don't worry, I've got enough tricks to keep them busy for a while. It's like juggling chainsaws, thrilling and likely to end in a mess. Tevrik turned to Clara and Milo. You two on the front lines. Keep the crowd focused and moving. We need their attention on the Directorate, not on whatever petty squabbles pop up. You mean like the last time someone argued about who stole whose rations? Milo asked, grinning. Exactly. We don't need infighting when we've got enough enemies outside, Tevrik replied, knowing full well that it was easier said than done. Humans were predictable creatures. Put them in a corner, and they'd either fight or cry. Sometimes both. They dispersed, each with their mission, leaving Tevrik to plan his next move. The Directorate would retaliate, that much was certain. They'd come in force, with drones and guns and all the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the face. And when they did, Tevrik intended to be ready. The next day, the sun rose over the Martian wasteland, a pale imitation of Earth's warmth. The sky was a merciless expanse of red, as if the planet itself was bleeding. Tevrik stood at the head of a makeshift barricade, his eyes on the horizon, waiting for the enemy to make their move. Sleep all right? Leora asked, sidling up beside him. Like a baby, Tevrik lied, though he doubted infants ever dreamt of impending doom and societal collapse. "Yeah, well, I dreamt of margaritas and a beach," she said, sighing. "Weird, right? Never seen either in person." Teverick chuckled, the sound almost foreign in this landscape of despair. "We'll make that happen. Once all this is over, we'll find the nicest beach Mars has to offer." "Huh, Mars has nothing but glorified sand traps," Milo interjected, joining them with his usual bravado. "But hey, maybe we can build a pool, call it an ocean." A ruckus interrupted their banter, a growing commotion from the direction of the settlement. Teverick's heart raced as he turned, half expecting to see Directorate enforcers bearing down on them with all the fury of a bureaucratic vendetta. Instead, it was a crowd, larger than before, and definitely angrier. They surged through the barricades, a tide of red and brown and human willpower. "We've got them," Clara said, her voice barely containing her excitement. "They're joining us. This is it." Teverick felt a thrill of hope, as potent as it was dangerous. More people meant more power, but also more risk. Too many moving parts, too many things that could go wrong. "All right," he called, his voice carrying over the crowd like a battle cry. "We've started something big. Now let's finish it." The rebels cheered, their voices rising in a chorus of defiance. It was a heady sound, like the roar of an engine ready to take off. "Just one problem," Leora said, her tone cutting through the euphoria like a laser through butter. "What?" She pointed to the sky, where dark shapes were descending. Drones. More than they'd ever faced before, a mechanical swarm sent to crush their rebellion before it could truly take root. "Looks like the Directorate's sending party favors," Milo remarked dryly. "How thoughtful." "Positions," Teverick barked, his voice snapping the rebels into action. They scattered, each taking up their place in the defensive line, makeshift weapons at the ready. The drones approached, their metallic bodies gleaming in the harsh Martian light. Teverick could almost hear the hum of their engines, feel the oppressive weight of their presence. "You ready for this?" Clara asked, a glint of steel in her eyes. "Always," Teverick replied, though he knew damn well that no amount of bravado would stop a bullet. The battle was fierce, chaotic, and more than a little terrifying. The rebels fought with everything they had: stones, scavenged tech, even their bare hands. The drones were relentless, but for every Martian that fell, two more rose to take their place. It was like trying to swat a swarm of bees with an old newspaper, a losing battle, but one they couldn't afford to lose. "Keep pushing," Teverick shouted, his voice hoarse from the dust and the shouting. "We can't let them advance." The rebels surged forward, a tide of determination and desperation. They fought like cornered animals, their survival instincts driving them forward. "This is madness," Leora said, ducking behind a barricade as a drone swooped overhead. "Madness?" Teverick echoed, a grim smile on his lips. "This is Mars." Leora rolled her eyes, but there was a spark of appreciation there. Gallows humor, at least, was better than no humor. The battle raged on, the tide shifting back and forth like a drunken sailor. But slowly, surely, the rebels began to gain the upper hand. The drones, for all their technological superiority, were no match for human tenacity and the sheer force of will. One by one, they fell, brought down by a hail of stones, improvised explosives, and sheer determination. The rebels pressed on, pushing the remaining drones back, driving them into retreat. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The drones were gone, leaving only wreckage and silence in their wake. "We did it," Clara said, her voice filled with disbelief. "We actually did it. Don't get too comfortable," Teverick cautioned, though he couldn't hide the pride in his voice. This was just the beginning. The rebels regrouped, tending to the wounded, gathering their fallen. It was a sobering task, a reminder of the cost of freedom. But they'd done it. They'd stood up to the Directorate, and they'd won. It was a small victory, but it was theirs. "Now what?" Milo asked, wiping the sweat and grime from his face. "Now," Teverick said, looking out over the Martian landscape, "we build something new." In the weeks that followed, the quarantine zone underwent a transformation. It wasn't pretty. Freedom never was, but it was theirs. The Directorate's grip on Mars had been shattered, their forces driven back, their power diminished. The rebels had taken control, and for the first time in living memory, the people of Mars were free to shape their own destiny. Teverick and his crew were at the heart of it, guiding the fledgling society through the growing pains of independence. It was a daunting task, like trying to herd cats with a water gun, but they faced it with the same determination that had carried them this far. Who knew building a society would be so much work? Milo grumbled, staring at a stack of plans and reports that threatened to swallow him whole. You're not just hacking into systems and causing chaos anymore, Clara teased, her smile as sharp as ever. Welcome to the real world. Leora was in her element, coordinating efforts, rallying support, her energy boundless. We've got a long way to go, but we're getting there. Teverick watched them, his crew, his family, and felt a sense of pride like never before. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd done it. Feels good, doesn't it? He asked, his voice filled with wonder. Yeah, Leora said, her eyes shining. It really does. The Directorate's days were over, their reign of control broken. In its place was something new, something better. And as Teverick looked out over the burgeoning settlement, he knew that this was just the beginning. They'd built something from the ashes of oppression, something stronger, something that would last. To Mars, he said, raising an imaginary glass in a toast. To Mars, his crew echoed, their voices filled with hope and determination. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time, that was enough.